really an honor. We really appreciate it. Well, here in Peru, there are many students and professionals who follow your work, and it is the first time, I think, we have the chance to talk to you. Well, all we know about ACT, but we would like to hear from you. So one of my first questions will be, what do you think makes ACT so powerful, and what is the main difference with cognitive behavioral therapy?
Well, ACT came out of the behavioral tradition and the cognitive behavioral tradition. I think of them as different faces of a single stream. I know around the world, sometimes people fight about the cognitive side, the behavioral side. But I've always thought of them as a larger group. And in the early days, they were like that. I mean, in the United States, what was then called the Association for Advancement of Behavior Therapy had behavior analysts, cognitive people, social learning people. Then they later on split up and these differences became more dominant. But what ACT is, because you're looking at somebody who is raised in a more behavior analytic, functional, contextual, behavioral tradition, is an attempt to maintain what I think is some of the spirit of that tradition while still stepping up to the challenge of language and cognition. I think what we're doing right now is different than what the bird outside the window is doing. And while basic learning principles with non-human animals are always relevant, just in the same way that studies of the digestive systems of mammals may be relevant to you, or genetics or epigenetics, still there are differences that happen with human functioning, and we needed to understand that. I think why ACT especially is been useful is we've spent more time developing a knowledge of the basic processes and principles, including even establishing a new and vigorous approach to language and cognition itself. And that allows you to do something that the mainstream CBT tradition couldn't do. When it jumped ahead from the behavioral tradition, it didn't have an adequate theory of cognition. It had no other alternative but to appeal to clinical theories of cognition. And that broke with the bottom-up, laboratory-based, process-focused, early tradition of functional analysis and behavior therapy. So ACT returns in a way to the spirit of the earlier work, but now with developments, intellectual and practical developments that allow you to really target thoughts, feelings, memories, bodily sensations in a way that's technically precise and practically useful and different than what was there in mainstream CBT. And it turns out, I think, more broadly applicable, maybe a little safer to apply. When you learn it, you can take it many different places, and I think it gives every sign of being progressive in terms of the breadth of application and understanding the basic principles. So I think it's a step forward. In terms of outcomes, it depends on the study and the area. I think there is clear evidence that you get some improvement in outcomes, but also maybe some improvement in broader sets of outcomes, not just signs and symptoms linked to psychiatric nosology. Now, in terms of why those principles are more applicable, we'll get into that in our conversation, but I think why ACT is maybe a little different, and I think of contemporary relevance are these more strategic, philosophical, and conceptual things having to do with 35 years of 37 years of development work behind ACT.
So, Steve, about, I remember once you said that, I don't know if it's a read or I hear you from you, but this is the contextual therapy is the modern phase of behavioral therapy. So in order to see what are the main difference between the first way therapies and the third way.
You know, what we're trying to do in the contextual therapies and in ACT specifically is to develop a functional contextual model of human functioning that's broadly applicable. And not just to traditional DSM diagnoses, but to the fostering of human prosperity, relationships, effectiveness at work, sport, stepping up to the challenge of physical disease. I mean, all the places that you'd want to take applied methods forward, we want to be a part of that. And I mean, I'm old enough to remember what it was like. I mean, I became a behaviorist because of Walden II. I mean, it seemed very important that you would have principles that had such scope and such precision that you'd be able to apply them even to how you're going to raise your children, how you're going to organize your family and communities, what about schools, etc. So the way we say it is from rats to Walden II, yeah. But the problem is that, you know, whilst the animal learning and early behavior analytic work was very good in establishing principles, it turned out to not be a fully adequate set. It's a good start, but it's not completed. It didn't, you know, so direct contingencies, for example, learning by operant and classical conditioning is about 545 million years old, 500 million years. How do you know that? Every species that evolved since the Cambrian period does it. No species that evolved before do it. And it arguably helps explain the Cambrian explosion. When animals are able to seek out and construct particular niches, well, then the selection pressures on phenotypic development become very dominant. And, you know, the flamingo's beak didn't come in order to dig up the mollusks. The birds were digging up the mollusks in the river mud first, and then the beak evolved. And it had to be able to be influenced by reinforcers to seek out the riverbed to do that. If you're a jellyfish or a sponge, you don't do that. But if you're any kind of complex organism since the Cambrian, you do. What Skinner argued was that selection by consequences within the lifetime of the individual contingencies of reinforcement added to these contingencies of survival. He didn't know about epigenetics, it just wasn't known at the time, and to cultural evolution to form a unitary, multidimensional evolutionary account. I don't think that's right, because it's not sufficiently adequate, but it's a really good start and it was brilliant for what it did. So what we're doing right now, I think, is an arguably new process. Language and cognition is, I believe, an operant process initially, but in the same way that epigenetics is a genetic process initially, but then operates back on genetics, contingencies of meaning that emerge from relational operants operate back on behavioral principles. We know that's true. You can take reinforcers and turning them into punishers. You can take eliciting stimuli and make them more or less eliciting without any particular history having to do with pairing, contingencies, probability of reinforcement, none of those things. Language and cognition changes how the brain responds to very basic kinds of things. Consciousness itself is different when you're able to engage in reflective, symbolic processes. So, you know, while contextual approaches and act as a carrying forward of that first wave tradition and spirit, it brings these other principles. Now, what difference does that make in an applied way? Well, one of the things, just take one, well, or two. You take something like cognitive diffusion. Diffusion is an attempt to use relational learning principles to alter the domination of verbal stimuli over our behavior, which for most of us happens very easily. This problem-solving symbolic stream is so broadly useful, so generally supported, from schools to what you watch on television from morning till night, that it takes over our repertoire, and we begin to think we are who we say we are, or that other people are, the stories that we apply to them, or that in order to have peace of mind, you have to have all of your thoughts lined up in a row and only have good ones and not bad ones. And very soon you're bringing problem solving to bear on processes where it has no business going. If I were to ask you just to say good or bad and gave you the word happy, I'm sure you'd say good. If I said sad, I'm sure you'd say bad.
Mm-hmm.
But I was there watching my 93-year-old mother die a couple of years ago. You know, I sat by her bedside. I rushed down when I heard on the plane. I got there just in time. I watched her feet turn black. I watched her breath space out, and I watched her take her last breath. Would you say that's sad? Well, I was there. I can tell you that was sad. Would you say that's bad? Well, nobody but an idiot would say that's bad. But you just said it. You just thought it when I said, would you say good or bad? When I said sad, you'd say bad. So you have this one evolved stream dominating over the others. For example, just your felt loss when somebody very close to you dies. And that is broadly applicable. That happens all the time. We're living inside our stories. We're running from things we don't like. We're clinging to things we do like. All of that's new inside life on this planet. It required a symbolic process to be able to do that and to partition this whole behavioral stream into things that you then focus on and fight with and get entangled with and put your life on hold while you try to fight the war within that you'll never win. So what ACT brings to the table is things that look like they're out of the wisdom traditions, out of our spiritual traditions, mindfulness traditions. It's not that they're absent in our culture. Every single culture has these things because we've been dealing with the problems of language and cognition and the evolutionary mismatch they present to us for a long time. But now ACT can come in with a kind of a bottom-up, functional analytic, process-based account. And it's not just hand waving. It's not just saying, oh, those are reinforcers, but without the data. There's several hundred studies now on relational operants and how they work. And if you just take something like diffusion, there's probably 100 studies on diffusion, or acceptance, probably 200 or 300, or maybe more, values, a couple, 300. And so in every area of the flexibility model that sits underneath ACT, there are data on the processes, the basic principles, the procedures that move those processes, how they interact with other processes, and how they produce better long-term outcomes. So it's not a panacea. I don't say we've won the war and now we've figured everything out. Nothing like that. I'm sure there's lots of things that are wrong inside the ACT model, RFT model, contextual model. But it's back to the spirit of the first wave, dealing with the problems of the second wave, with methods that characterize the third wave, and all of that linked to an agenda that is trying to create a more progressive behavioral science. And I think we have some good reasons to believe we're creating a more progressive behavioral science. I think we're making progress in several areas: impact on the people, understanding of the processes, and then the other one I would add, getting the practitioner in the picture too. Because it turns out the methods that we explore inside ACT and RFT are useful to clinicians themselves. They help prevent professional burnout. They increase the sense of personal accomplishment. People are able to apply these methods and principles to almost everybody they see, and they take them home with them, and it's helpful there too. That's nice. You know, people probably know I came into this work out of my own panic disorder. And when I tried to apply what I knew about behavior therapy and CBT at that time, this is behavior therapy circa 1975, mind you, this is a long time ago. But still, I mean, I was trained by Beckians and Ellisonians, REBTers and all that, plus behavior analysts. When I did that, I was not able to get much traction on my own personal struggles. And you don't want to be in a position where you're applying methods to your clients that when you have the same problem, you wouldn't use yourself. And that is very common clinically, to be telling people to do things that you know when it's your stuff, it doesn't help you. We just cannot allow ourselves to be in that position. So I think we're making progress, and it's part of why ACT and contextual behavioral thinking is spreading so fast. It's because it empowers clinicians, but it also reaches their hearts, and it goes home with them in ways that allows you then to look at the data. We're not saying that in substitutive data. This is not a cult. This is not a, I believe. This is science, but we want science that's personally relevant, and that combination of relevant to me, relevant to people I work with, broadly applicable, has produced situations where if you do surveys now in some areas, I saw a recent one in chronic pain, 30% of the clinicians now around the world are using ACT with chronic pain. I mean, that's crazy, 30%. And I think it's only going up because the data and the usefulness and the relevance are there. But I do say we have to keep developing. It's not a fixed thing. It's a community that keeps pushing the ball down the road.
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Steve, we are here in Peru, we are a little delayed about the knowledge. For example, contextual behavioral science and process-based therapy. This term is not a common language here for psychologists on Peru. So can you define this term for us?
Sure. Well, contextual behavioral science is just our name for the collection of philosophical steps and strategic steps that are based on, but a step forward from, traditional behavior analysis and radical behaviorism. I believe, and at least people disagree on this, but I believe that the behavior analytic tradition, if you know that tradition, is best understood as not being mechanistic, but contextualistic. It's holistic. The operant is not like, little pieces put together like a Lego set, like toys that children build. They're one whole thing, more like something that you can turn and look at from different sides. Antecedent, behavior, consequence is all one thing in a motivational set. So I've always thought of behavior analysis as a kind of ongoing acting context. Now, Skinner, I think, made a few errors. He said the purpose of science is prediction and control, for example. Well, then the scientists who don't have that purpose, of course, are deeply offended. They're saying, well, are you saying I'm not a scientist? I'm not interested in control. Never mind, it's a bad word. We say prediction and influence. But no, but if you're a contextualist and you believe that truth is successful working, that only works as a truth criterion with verbal behavior when you specify your goals beforehand. Otherwise, any reinforcer is true, and that's stupid. I mean, that would mean that drug addiction is true, all kinds of terrible habits are true. No, you don't want to do that. But so once you say, okay, what we mean by truth is getting something accomplished, that makes sense. It's a kind of evolutionary epistemology, pragmatic view. You have to state what your goals are. And so prediction and influence is a goal. In contextual behavioral science, it gets modified a little bit. We want to do that with precision, scope, and depth. So we want principles that we can know that this principle applies to this situation, but not that situation. And we want principles that apply to many situations. So that's precision in the application. So you can't just say anything. There's only certain things that are technically correct. But you also want technical terms that go way beyond mere description, that summarize and put together. I mean, a long row full of bread recipes will tell you how to bake a cake, but if you understand, how yeast works and how it interacts with the material, you know a lot more, and you can say a lot with just a few things. I mean, E equals MC squared is wonderful because it's precise and amazingly broad in scope. Reinforcement, amazingly broad in scope. So, and then the final one is depth, which means that you want to be able to connect across levels of analysis. You never want to be in a position at the psychological level that contradicts what we know at the anthropological or sociological level, or at the neurobiological level, or genetic level, or epigenetic level. We seek a unified fabric of science. So that's one thing. We're going to tweak radical behaviorism into what's called functional contextualism. And it cleans up some of Skinner's messes. They're just little messes, but they're messes that if you don't clean up leads to a kind of arrogance, riding over other people, not listening, thinking that your goals are the goals and the only goals, which is dogmatism. It's just another form of dogmatism. The other thing that contextual behavioral science did is early on, two things. One is decide that we shouldn't be deciding on the usefulness of our terms by their dictionary different definitions and appearance, but rather by their utility in the contexts in which that we use them. And when we're trying to understand others using terms, we do the same thing. Now that's just behavioral wisdom. Meaning is use. But you don't have to go very far if you're around behavioral people before if you start talking about spirits or souls or mind or intention or expectation or you name it, they're going, oh, you're a mentalist. Oh, wait a minute, why? Go look at this dictionary definition. And so the very first article that led to CBS was called Making Sense of Spirituality, published in the journal Behaviorism. It's a nice behavioral analysis of the conditions under which a term like spirituality is used. And it led directly, it's the earliest piece. You can see RFT is coming. You can see that ACT is coming. It led directly to deictic framing, I, you, here, there, and now then, the perspective taking frames in RFT. If you've studied it, if not, I'm sorry for speaking ahead of where you are, but if you get interested, you'll get there. Of, perspective taking in a sense of I, here, nowness as a core awareness that emerges somewhere around 3 or 4 or 5, and is the context in which experiences of timelessness, spacelessness, other spiritual experiences occur as these perspective-taking frames expand. Like I can get a sense of what it might be like for you to be looking at me, and not just because I have a little thing over there showing an old bald guy. Even without it, I could do this. Because I have flexibility of person. I could imagine what my grandkids might think looking at this tape. I have flexibility with regard to person and time. Or place, I can imagine a bit about what it might be like to be in Peru, speaking to somebody here in the US. So we broke with the rigid, I don't think Skinner did it. Skinner was pretty good on this. I mean, he has a famous quote, I'm not saying there is no mind, I'm just saying those words get in the way of more important things. That's brilliant, it's perfect. But there are times when those words don't get in the way of more important things. So I want to talk about meaning and purpose and intention, but I don't want to mentalize it. And so we did a lot of work as to how to think of relationships between verbal behavior and other behavior. And the basic way you do it behaviorally, there's a context in which the verbal behavior occurs, there's a context in which the other behavior occurs, and there's a context that glues those together. That's what diffusion is. Diffusion is going after that context that glues them together. If you take a word that makes easy meaning for you, like the word milk, let's say, leche, right? And say it over and over and over and over again, about once per second, about 30 seconds, white, creamy, cold will disappear. And what you'll be left with is a weird feeling in your mouth and an odd sound. And so what is the point? The point is that there's a context in which, for example, right now, if you understand English, and if I'm speaking clearly, you're with me in terms of this sentence, and you're kind of waiting for the period to come. Can you feel it? There's an end to this sentence, but we're not there yet. And when it gets there, I'll be able to understand what the thought is. I'm not quite sure yet what he's saying. He's talking. I'm waiting for the end of the sentence. And finally, here comes the end of the sentence. And now you get my point. Ding. Well, that is a kind of an elaborated sense of meaning inside this symbolic stream. And we need to account for that. We need to account for contingencies of meaning, not just contingencies of reinforcement. And then the final thing from a CBS point of view is, there's many other things, but that are big, is that we took away the idea that bottom-up science is the only way, and we developed a view we called reticulated science. And here's what it means. In the early days of behavior analysis, the idea, and for a long, long time, and still not today in many areas, and not just behavior analysis, other areas, The idea is the base, the foundation, what's basic. We'll give you the principles, and then you'll apply it. It means in Latin to bring in contact with these social issues. Yeah. Yeah, but who's going to give you the base to stand on as a practitioner? Are you going to just wait for the basic science to do it? What if they're not interested in your important questions? And here's an example: language pragmatics. Vast literatures on, psycholinguistics and on structural analysis of language. How about language pragmatics? Well, I came into this because I'm a clinician trying to understand verbal rules and how they land on people. And I'm trying to look at my own struggles with mental health problems and with my own anxiety disorder and understand it in that way and apply it to clients. It wasn't there. I mean, Skinner would say rule-governed behavior. And I say, what is that? Contingency specifying stimuli. What is that? Never said. He can't tell you what specifying is. He never defined it. And frankly, he can't, because it contradicts verbal behavior. There's no way you can find what specification means if you're a Skinnerian without undermining his analysis in the 1957 book called Verbal Behavior. My ex, Linda Parrott, was the first to really nail him on that. I was in the room when he did it, when she did it to him. Behaviorism in a contextualistic frame, we take responsibility for it by becoming clear on our goals. We state them publicly. We liberalize how we use language, while at the same time requiring more of a technical account of the domains we orient towards with words like self or acceptance or diffusion or meaning or values. These are not technical terms. They orient you towards places with a technical analysis. And then we hold everybody to account. It's reticulated, meaning like the web structure on a reticulated giraffe with their, just means web-like. So that if you're the practitioner and you don't have the basic principles you need, tag, that's your responsibility. You develop it. If it's not there, you or your colleagues, not every single person has to do it, do the basic science or inspire it sufficient to answer your applied questions. Similarly, if you're a basic scientist and saying, oh, if you only listen to me, you could do so many wonderful things. Okay, you do that. You go show these wonderful things. Don't be going blah, 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 tag, that's your responsibility. Yeah. No, it's the whole community. And the effect of that has been that most of the RFT work has been done by clinicians in the early days. And only now has it really taken hold in the basic science. Or there are many basic RFT people who do language training work or clinical work or social development justice work, attitude change, things of that kind. That's how it should be. We're all responsible for our field. And so now process-based therapy is just the spirit of the early days of behavior analysis brought now into CBT, where instead of off-the-shelf technologies and protocols being applied to syndromal entities, 5 out of 9 and 4 out of 7. Instead, we detect the change processes that would move lives negatively or positively in the individual and do an analysis of how they fit together idiographically, and then take the kernels that are needed, never mind the brand name, never mind the, I didn't invent it, so I can't use it thing, or, oh, that's what Gestalt people do, or, oh, that's cognitive. Oh, please. It's so primitive. No physicist, chemist, or would do anything like that. It's only psychologists who are this stupid. And it's time for us to let go of these islands, not by vapid eclecticism, not by throwing everything into a big stew. We're not going to make gumbo. But no, what are the biopsychosocial processes that are inhibiting or promoting growth in this person, and how can I best target the particular processes that are most needed for that client's particular goals. And so that means abandoning the idea of protocols for syndromes as a model of evidence-based therapy, and instead going back to the early days of behavior therapy, and where you have idiographic functional analysis that links processes to procedures, but with a much broader set of processes, and that goes across all the different domains and levels that you need to evolve a system. And I mentioned the words evolve a system because once you get to process-based care and you realize how idiographic and functional it needs to be, we've increasingly found a lot of benefit by thinking of this as multidimensional, multi-level evolution science, simply being applied to the evolution of an individual human life in the context of the evolution of our culture, our families, our species, our world. And you can bring this kind of world responsibility sense to the individuals, couples, families, communities, clinics that you're working with. So that's Stefan Hoffman, who's probably one of the best known second wave CBT people on the planet. I have been shocked to discover is probably one of the best behavior analysts on the planet. He's very functional and contextual in his thinking. And so we're going to pull this functional idiographic perspective into the heart of CBT and evidence-based therapy. And it's not an artificial thing. I think we're ready to do it. And when you do that, now, what is the big difference between the behavioral wing, the cognitive wing? It's just a matter of what works best. Let's find out. And so I think we're finding instead of walls and division, we're headed into an era with bridges and connection. And that will be good for the people that we serve, I think, if we do it right.
Yes, yes. It's great. I read your last book, Evolution and Behavioral Science. It's a really book. It's my book. I have a book here.
I recommend it. I think it's a very important book.
It's a very, very interesting book. So
it's kind of geeky, frankly. If people buy it thinking they're going to know what to do in therapy, no. But if you want to see where the future, I think, goes, those books will come, but it's going to start sitting atop.
For me, honestly, I know about ACT, I know behaviors, but this part of evolution, Darwin, this link you did between Darwin into Skinner is really surprisingly. So, I saw in your slide for the training you did in Long Island. You remember? The training, I was there in the training, and you had a slide about these processes: selection, retention, and variation. So the question is, how? I know a little bit. I would like to hear from you. How these processes, this evolutionary process, retention, variation, fits into the ACT model.
I think for applied evolution science, I mean, evolution science is a huge area, and there's many, many things to learn. You could spend the rest of your life studying it. It's a lot of fun. And some of it is very reductionistic. Some of it, like the genes maybe do it almost. I think it's old-fashioned. I don't think that's where evolution science is going. And because of its own progress, I mean, for example, when we were able to map the full human genome in hundreds of thousands of people, we could finally look and say, oh, by golly, none of our DSM disorders are genetic in any kind of simple way. And not just that, I mean, take something like height, how high you are. We're already up to 724 gene loci are involved in height. And it's still only accounting for, 25% of the variants or something. You only have 24,000 genes. I mean, so this cartoon version, of evolution, genes and the secret life of genes, blind watchmaker, and, the Dawkins kind of take, I think, is done, finished empirically. It's time for us to put it behind us and instead go back to not go back, actually go forward, but in a way, go back to the evolutionary synthesis in which we understand evolution is occurring in multiple dimensions and at multiple levels. But there's only 6 words that you really need for application, I think. variation and a selection that's retained in context at the right dimension and level. It's only 6 words: variation, selection, retention, dimension, context, level. The ones that you probably would, variation, selection, retention, you'd probably know about. Of course, that you have life and death with regard to genetic selection, but also, cultural practices within the lifetime of the individual, contingencies of reinforcement. But now we know there's other dimensions in there. It's not just those 3. Skinner was wrong. There's probably at least 4, if not 5, and maybe more dimensions. But if you're going to do it as an application, you better understand context. What is the context in which, if you get variation going, if you have a client who's just doing what they're doing, they're not going to change. They have to show some change before they can change. You have to perturbate a system. You have to knock it sideways. Almost anything new is helpful. Anything. I mean, come in and sing with your clients, stand on your head, anything. Because when some of your clients are so locked down, they're only doing 1 thing or 2 things or 4 things that they've done over and over and over and over, and they're coming in and asking you to do the same and make it turn out different, and it's not going to. If you do the same, it's going to be the same. But then when you do have variation, when you're able to perturbate a system, you have to notice what's moving you towards or away from your goals. What is the selection criteria? Now, in genetic evolution, it's life and death. But in the evolution of an individual, it can be whatever they want it to be, whatever the particular selection criteria are, whether it's developing a sense of belonging and connection with others, a sense of peace of mind, purpose, community, contribution, creativity. You tell me, I don't know. Well, let's find out. And then it turns out people actually know a lot about this. If you ask people, for example, to show with their body, you at your worst with the problems you're struggling with versus you at your best. Same problem, you at your worst, you're at best. Just ask your client that. And you at their worst, they'll show you something like this, they'll put their head down, they'll cover themselves up, they'll bring their arms on. They'll show a defensive posture or maybe an offensive posture. At their best, they'll show openness, their head will come up, their eyes will open, their hands will go out. It's an expression of being able to sort of be here and being able to move and orient towards what's of importance. Well, in other words, people already know the selection criteria. They know, but they have this one dimension, this analytic, judgmental, problem-solving thing, this new kid on the block that's been around 200,000 to 2.8 million years. We know that chimpanzees don't do it, so it has to be before we split from our common ancestor with the chimpanzees. My guess is the hominids were doing it, so it's older than 200,000 years old. It's not just our species, but it's our branch that's doing this kind of thing. So we can then deliberately look at context and say, well, what would support these positive variants? And what are the dimensions I need to work on? I mean, language breaks up behavior into streams. We talk about our body and its sensations, our emotions and our motivational states. We talk about our memories or our fears and worries. So some of that is artificial. I mean, I don't think dogs and cats are breaking up behavior that way, but we're doing it with language. Are you hungry? How are you feeling? Oh, little Stevie, you look sad today. I mean, we're doing it from the time they're born, and we draw them into this human community with all these dimensions. Which of these dimensions do we need to focus on? Well, it could be emotions, could be thoughts, could be motivation, could be sense of self, could be attention, could be overt behavior. But then it occurs nested, because it doesn't do any good if I'm working with you as a whole organism, but it turns out you're sleeping horribly and you're eating nothing but junk food. I have to worry about your physical health too. And most clinicians have gotten used now to asking people about diet, exercise, sleep as a normal thing, even though they're a psychotherapist, because they know how important. But in the same way, I can't treat you as if you're disconnected from the social community. That's not the kind of monkey we are. So I want to know about your relationships, your intimate relationships, your sexual life. What's going on with your family? Are you worried about your kids? How are you doing at work? What about your neighbors? Are you well connected to your extended family? I want to know about the nestedness of your life in the social communities that you're part of, social groups you're part of. And so if you look at an ACT model, for example, acceptance and diffusion are producing flexibility around the major repertoire narrowing parts of human functioning, which is, I only want to feel good things, and I want to apply this problem-solving judgmental motive mind to everything. Diffusion and acceptance fattens that distribution. You can have multiple feelings that are even contradictory, that's okay. You can deepen your sense even of sadness or of anger or resentment to see what's inside it. You can broaden your attention emotionally. The same thing with thoughts. You can notice that you have contradictory thoughts. You both love and are angry with your husband. You are both want and not want that promotion at work, etc. And then in the middle, these context sensitivity processes of flexible attention to the now, being able to attend to what's present flexibly, fluidly, and voluntarily. Attention's not a mental event. It's a verbally directed repertoire of augmenting or diminishing stimulus control. And it requires an analysis. It's not, you don't explain things by attention, you explain things by the context that establish flexible, fluid, and voluntary attention versus narrow, rigid attentional processes. And that is from a perspective or point of view. It's from this observing, I hear now kind of point of view that allows you in context to sort of notice what the things are that show up to get in your way, the things that lead you to do this, to be able to situate it in the social context, the present context, inside and out. And then values gives you the conversation that you need about what are the qualities of being and doing that you want to put into your life. What are the intrinsic qualities of your behavior that you want to have occur at a higher frequency? And how would you build habits around that? The committed action piece of being committed to a larger and larger patterns of values-based behavior. That's retention. That's practice and pattern is how behavior is retained. Life and death, that's how, genes are retained. Practice and pattern, that's how behavior is retained. So variation, selection, retention, in context, those four things are there in the ACT model. And what we need then is to socially extend them. So for example, I'm not just concerned with acceptance as it applies to my own emotions. I'm concerned also with my compassion towards you in whatever emotions you may be experiencing, that some of which may be difficult. Or it's not just my values. My values will connect me to the values of my community and culture. That's in part where they came from. And so we need to look at the levels and make sure that we're not being selfish at any one level, because multi-level selection says basically higher levels of organization can work and be selected only when you dampen down selfishness at the lower level and where all levels get to succeed. So for example, the cells in your body do better in your body than they would put on a petri dish somewhere without any food to eat. They'll die very quickly. But if one cell in your body says, I think I just want a whole lot more of me, of course, it's not saying anything, you know what I mean? Well, that's cancer. And you have systems for detecting that, changing it if you can, or killing the cell if it still insists on being a rebel. Or then you're in for treatment for the chemical means or whatever means we have to help you kill that cell. The same thing at all levels, including the behavioral level. The big problem with things like worry, rumination, etc., is these little repertoires that are within us and will always be within us. A traumatic memory, a criticism, they'll always be with us. There's no delete button in the nervous system that's healthy, short of brain injury. And it isn't a problem that we have these difficult, painful memories. They humanize us. They connect us to others and the pain they experience. But it is a problem when you give it more attention than it's worth, given what you want to have in your life, which is the functional equivalent to behavioral cancers. I mean, what you have with people walking in for treatment is they have behavioral cancers. They have repertoires that are claiming all of their attention instead of just the proper amount of attention. And so like a worry worry may be worth just this much attention, but you have clients coming in where it's getting this much attention. That no, we have to do something about that. So back to evolutionary principles, I think you can, and we're seeing it's not just a blah, blah, blah. I mean, we're actively right now linking ACT to the development of pro-social groups using Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning design principles, how indigenous peoples were able to protect their forests, lakes, rivers, and streams through communal action. For thousands of years, we've learned how to cooperate. That's the kind of monkey we are. And we can combine what we learn in psychotherapy with what the evolutionists are learning in small groups, and maybe even do something about the global warming, or the what do we do about immigration, or what about racism, or this horror of Me Too. And you realize how much gender bias and outright abuse is just in our everyday culture between men and women. Something needs to be done about these things, yeah? So it's not hand-waving. That book will show you it's not hand-waving, but it is early. It's something that Skinner's last dying sentence was, variation and retention is going to be important to behavior analysts. I mean, he wrote a sentence about evolution, building on many articles and so forth, with his dying breath. And I wrote an article called Carrying the Baton, because I suppose that dying breath is like passing a baton, and I would like to grab it and run forward with it and see if we can carry this very useful, functional, contextual behavioral tradition forward in a way that maybe someday could actually be like from rats to Walden 2. It could somebody be from bacteria to Bach, as Daniel Dennett said in his book, but now with real technologies that could do that. And that's what we're up to in the CBS group. It's not act uber alles. It's not we're right and you're wrong. It's about how to get this process vision nested inside the best functional contextual vision in the life sciences, bar none, which is, I believe, multidimensional, multi-level evolution science. And then come together in community across all these different subdisciplines and theoretical orientations and create some progress in the interests of the clients we serve and the communities that we're part of.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, this is really interesting. I think thanks to the ACBS, as you said, also about from your work, the work of Stefan, David Sloan Wilson, there are now there are many bridges that is open between ACT, CBT, contextual behavioral science, and evolution also. Do you think could we come a time? So I think we are in that way, but also there are many egos, for different psychologists about that. This is something like this is mine. This is the interesting. Oh no, this is not. There's something missing, etc., etc. But and that's not. I don't know. That's kind of a team of all psychologists, because it's very rare. Like we are mental health, but we are always fighting between us. So, do you think could we come a time when the evidence-based therapies will integrate that as a big broad model focusing in processes, so like was in the umbrella of contextual behavioral science, evolution? What do you think?
Yeah, I do think that's happening right in front of us. And of course, human beings always have their, grasping at particular terms and traditions and heroes, all that is. We need to be understanding of that. We all do it. But we can, in the interest of the people we serve, try to dampen that down as best we can and really focus on what produces progress and value for others, and not just position and power for ourselves. And so, for example, I kind of originated ACT. I don't allow myself to be called the developer, because many people have done that. Kelly and Kirk, but not just that. My lab, but not just that. This larger community. But now working with process-based therapy, for example, well, am I part of traditional CBT? well, I never really left traditional. I mean, I wasn't trying to hurt CBT. I just wanted models that work. I mean, I did the research in the early 80s that told me that the traditional cognitive model wasn't going to work. I mean, I did those component analyses and even, this is the kind of studies that Neil Jacobson did, pulling it apart. I did that 15, 20 years earlier. Not as well, small studies, but enough to convince me. So it's not that I'm anything against the cognitive model. What I wanted was a model that really worked. By moving to process-based and even evolution-based, anybody can come. I've not met any major psychological scientist who wants to stand up and say, and what I do has nothing to do with evolution. Good. Project right now, Stefan Hoff and myself, Joe Sorochi at Australian Catholic University, we're evaluating the mediational results of every randomized trial ever done on any psychological intervention. 55,000 studies are being evaluated. Wow. And every single successful mediator we're putting into a multidimensional, multi-level evolutionary model. Is this focused on variation, selection, retention, or context in the areas of emotion, or of cognition, or of attention, or sense of self, motivation, or overt behavior? And does it connect with the physiological components within or the social? So multidimensional, multi-level, selection, retention. These are not really foreign terms. I mean, in normal terms, variation is change, selection is function, retention is habit. Context is, fit and support within the particular person's culture and history. So what I'm trying to do is find a way not to challenge people and say, stop talking that way. That word is the same as my word. You have to use my word. No, please. Yeah. Instead, what I'm trying to do is go up and say, the game we're playing is to come up with these important processes that we can apply to people. And, where inside this very high level, 35,000 foot thing, where would these concepts fit? And then let all flowers bloom based not on your charisma or your capacity to persuade and argue, but based on the bottom line results for people. And science is wonderful at filtering those out. So when we shift from randomized trials for protocols for syndromes to, I think it's going to be very much more like, yes, randomized trials, but inside that, idiographic dynamical systems analyses, something that looks a little more like time series designs, but really in a much more sophisticated way, looking at complex networks. Not this crude thing of mediation and one-headed arrows, and because it's many variables and they're all relating to each other. But we can do this now statistically and mathematically if we have enough data of really looking at what are the processes of change that do the best job of predicting what element will move that person, how to perturbate that system and to move them forward inside. I believe the way to do it is inside an extended evolutionary account, where all these egos and stuff can be sublimated to a scientific language that has such credibility and history of success that we're able to speak in two ways. We would speak in our particular way inside our little subgroups, but also in this broader way linked to evolutionary principles. We'll see, but if we did that, here's the exciting thing. I can see the day. Behavior analysts are now, the old behavioral tradition is on top of cognition right now. I mean, RFT opens the door to every single kind of topic you may want to deal with in cognition. It just does, empirically, not just as a kind of, I can interpret it. I don't want an interpretation substituting for data. I want real data. You show me that you can take kids who don't speak and get them to speak. Otherwise, you shut up. I don't want to hear your blah, 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 blah about language. You can't do anything with kids who don't have language. Hello? So, excuse me if and that traditional kind of functional behavioral thing now being linked to something where we can get the cognition part and the emotion part, attention, sense of self. But not just that, as we go process-based inside CBT, we become more idiographic. You have to read some of my current articles with Stefan, and you'll see why. Statistically, it's required. I'll leave the argument for there. It's complex, but very simple, and I think you find it useful. Well, if the behaviorists and the cognitivists and the CBT folks can all get together in a way, and then they're nestled underneath evolution science, so that you get the functional biologists and anthropologists and sociologists together in a way. What good is all these little islands in the archipelago, each with their fences and, you know, weapons to keep the enemy out? I mean, it's crazy. It's time to let that go. It's, but not by let it go just by saying, oh, we're all friends here, everybody gets a prize. No, not everybody will get a prize, but you know, creating a psychology more worthy of the challenge of the human condition, that if we can do that, that's worth a prize. And the prize is being able to be useful. It's not being remembered or being anointed. If you allow me just 1 minute on that, in workshops I always ask people to name all of their great-great-grandparents, including their maiden names and where they were born. And only about 1 out of 200 people can do it, which means your children's children won't even know your name. Mm-hmm. So what are you fighting over with all this stuff about, oh, my ideas? You're going to die, dude, and nobody's going to remember you. But if you can do something with your life that puts things into the cultural stream, including the part of the culture we call science and called application and psychotherapy, it may be there for your great-great-grandchildren. And they won't know to thank you, but their lives will be better. And that's worth it. Mm-hmm. That's the game. So these, you know, the people early on, but it's continuing to this day. I mean, if you look at the Matrix or the DNAV, or there's lots of things inside Choice Point, things inside the ACT tradition that are different conceptually and technologically. And so we shouldn't think that it's stopped, but you've been on a multi-decade journey as a community. ACBS, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, you'll notice not the Association for ACT. That's not what it is. The Association for a Knowledge Development Tradition. And you know, ACT will come and go, RFT will see, but this intellectual tradition, this functional contextual tradition, is as old as psychology and even before. And it's a little hard to see sometimes. Mechanistic ideas will overwhelm it, reductionistic ideas will overwhelm it. And so it's good to see it playing now in a way that allows it to be seen. And but the point I'm just making is this process of development applies to the people in Peru who are interested in the work. What is your voice? What do you think? What would you add? What does your culture say? What are your traditions? Do you have data for it? Can you do those studies? Can you bring new ideas in? Can you connect it to other things that you've done that are useful? Can you build it into something that's theoretically coherent and empirically of importance? And to do that in a way that it understands how hard and how long you have to work to make that happen. That isn't something you just do a one and done. You don't just put out a paper that analyzes something or one empirical article. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that now. I mean, there's 50 randomized trials out of Iran on ACT, and they're different. They have a different feel to them. Kelly and Kirk and the early developers were really critical to it, as I think I was, but that's not the future. The future is going to be written by the young, not by the old.
Yeah, well, here, as you know, in Peru, there are a few studies, but I think we doesn't have the requirements to put in a big magazine or a scientific magazine. So, for example, two of my friends working with us, they has 2 studies from his bachelor thesis. So we are in that way, but here it's difficult because we have many barriers, but I think for this approach of contextual behavioral science, the RFD, that is like a sounds more frequently here, will help us to get some tools to look for do that. So it's that's why it's very important that for example this interview with you, because we have to hear you from you. That you said about that, no? Like we are clinician, but we have to know science basics. We have to pull in that. We have to make studies, and that's the issue.
Well, one thing I do want to say, I mean, the ACT technology and methods and so forth, those can be learned. There's people in your country, including yourself, with a bit of exposure to some of these training methods and can bring them into contact with others. When you do that, when you have some personal experience, you applied it to your clients, you've looked at some tapes. And if you go to ACBS, you can join for $12 a year. Yes. I know it's still a little bit of money, but it's not so bad. And even if that's not enough, you know, email the director and they try to help people around the world if they can't afford even that. But when you get there, there's thousands of pages and methods and videos.
Yes.
Now there is a language barrier, there is, and there's only so many things that are in Spanish, for example. But I'm saying it can be learned, and once you're personally in contact with it and you sort of begin to apply it, it actually simplifies because there's only 6 processes, the number of methods that move them. You can start with a small set, and it applies so broadly. But the other thing I want to say is, especially if you think about this as an extended evolutionary way, and the cultural part matters and so forth, it matters that people are actually developing new knowledge in all of these different language communities and cultural communities and ethnicities around the world. And where I think we're going is not the era of big randomized trials with all of these things that would take $1 million to fund, that would only be able to be done in a large medical center. And oh, by the way, only in Western societies that can afford it. And oh, by the way, very dominantly white. I mean, something's wrong with that. You just cannot let that stay there. But the development that's happening, go read, there's a piece in Behavioral Research and Therapy on the role of the individual in process-based therapy. Look at that piece, and where I walk out a little bit of even the statistical errors that are being made to over-rely on randomized controlled trials, especially also in the area of processes of change with mediation. What we're going to need is something more like very high density longitudinal data, person by person, something more like ecological momentary assessment, with devices that are not put through psychometrics, which is the wrong level of analysis, but more like what Cattell called the P technique. In modern terms, we would say is a complex network. And those things which are available on any, you know, if they have a phone, you can reach them with this, you know, and many people have this, even people who are poor. Not in all places, but pretty amazing how many people have a phone that you can actually ask some questions. If you can get very simple measures that look at context and process and outcome within the individual at high density, one at a time, every single clinician can be part of developing the kind of data that we need. Once we have the analytic tools, which are available for free if you can get yourself to deal with things like R and some of the statistical packages. The packages to do this are free. They're available online. And we're going to need to be able to say, for example, this client, when this client engages in experiential avoidance, worry and rumination become very dominant. And then they begin to get fused about that. And then values-based action shrinks. And then they start withdrawing from people. And then depression shows up. And then they start using substances, whatever the particular thing is. That story, or different stories, because different people with different stories, told over and over and over again, and then built up into nomothetic knowledge, but never treating the individual as an error term. Individual is not an error term. That was an error we made in psychology, and about 95% of our data are based on the wrong level of analysis. Our whole field is based on the wrong data. But the clinicians know this because they're doing one couple, person, family, class at a time, one at a time. And so I think where we're going to go with evidence-based care requires the engagement of practitioners in knowledge development and interpretation. And that doesn't mean just being part of a big study that some big grant getter at the local university came up with. So I don't know. I think the more communitarian cultures, for example, will, such as your own, in my opinion, will do a better job of coming into community and having people develop the kind of knowledge that will really allow us to step forward. And yeah, you'll need some local people who understand stats enough to understand complex networks, enough to understand how to put a frequent assessment into an analysis. But a modern form of functional analysis is coming. It's not very far away. You can use the flexibility processes in ACT, the psychological flexibility model, right now to do a better job of, I think, of diagnosis than you can from the DSM, in my opinion. It'll say more about what to do and how to do it with more people by far than the DSM. So what if we involved communities around the world in a knowledge development strategy that started with the bedrock of the individuals with whom we are working? Wouldn't that be cool? And I think you may find that you know, the Latin American voice, the Peruvian voice is a very important part of that picture if it chooses to be. I hope it will. Does this make sense? You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah,
So
yes, totally makes sense. And also it's very, it's encouraged, you encouraged me. For example, I'm a clinician. I work for a general hospital. And I was thinking, I was like a pieces in my mind to make a study with my, because I have many patients, later. So yeah, thank you for your work. Thank you also for all of the Peruvians, clinicians, practitioners, students. That it's very encouraged for us to put hands at work. Yeah, I hope soon we have many studies coming soon. Thank you very much, Steve.
Well, I've enjoyed being in your country. I've been, I think, 3 times, and in Arequipa and Cusco and Lima, different places, including many years ago and so forth. So I know how beautiful your country is. I took my little boy and my eldest daughter to not too long ago at the World Congress when it was in Lima. By the way, I was chair of the committee that picked Lima. I made sure that the Australians came second and the Peruvians came first. I'll tell you that story sometime, because I thought, time's up. We're going to Latin America. We're not going to yet another white, well-developed country. They can wait in line. The Australians were a little upset, but they got the next turn. But when I was there in Lima, we spent time touring, and we just love Peru. It's one of the most exotic and beautiful places in the world, in my opinion. And of course, the people having such good hearts and willingness to work together in community. If that can be harnessed, as the way that I was saying, I think we can use that in a way to do good around the world. So I welcome the opportunity to speak with you and through you to your colleagues. I hope it was of some use.
Thank you very much, Steve. We really appreciated your time. Yeah, I know you're a busy man, so this is very thank you. So that's I hope so. So well, it is that's last word for the Peruvian people here.
Last word.
Yes, sir?
I hope to see. I hope to see it move forward, and look forward to hearing your voice.
Thank you very much, Steve. We really appreciate it.